Hello, story lovers, and welcome back to my channel, Tales with Tasha. I am Tasha, and I am a storyteller. I hope you will enjoy the stories on my channel as much as I do. We're into week 2 of our sci-fi marathon. This week, we have been dipping our toes into the world of telepaths and telekinetics, tapping into the powers of the mind. Today we find out all about the shock of hearing voices. Don't forget to let me know your favourite genres or themes in the comments, so I can make sure to have you covered in planning for the rest of 2022. If you enjoy today's story, please give it a thumbs up to like it and feed the algorithm gods. And if you would consider subscribing, that would be amazing. It really helps boost the channel. Thank you, lovelies. This story is what I would define as PG-ish, suitable for most viewers, but probably not of interest to the youngest. With that being said, make sure you're sitting comfortably, and let's jump right on in. Deep Thoughts, Rewiring the Brain by Natasha Duncan Drake. It started when James missed his footing in a practice session, tripped over a wire and managed to knock himself out on Ken's amp. At least Phil assumed that was when it started, because it was only after that James had begun acting strangely. At first, it had been the odd time when James had seemed to phase out for a few moments. Then James had become jumpy at the weirdest things. When James had shown up for the planning meeting that morning, Phil had known something was very wrong. James could look as scruffy as the rest of them if he couldn't be bothered, but today James looked as if he'd stumbled into his clothes rather than put them on. His hair was a mess, and it didn't look like he'd slept in days. "James, sit," Phil said immediately, all but pushing his friend into the nearest chair. The fact that James cringed away from him was worrying, and the way James kept avoiding looking at him after he managed to get his bandmate sitting down was even worse. Something was seriously wrong. Phil decided there and then he had to find out what it was. "You look like shit," he said, expecting some sort of reaction. But James just sat there staring at the table. "James, tell me what's going on. You haven't been yourself since the fall. Is something wrong?" James did not respond. Phil thought his friend had zoned on him for a moment, but when he reached forward to gain James's attention, James shied away again. "That's it," Phil said firmly. "I'm calling the others and telling them not to come. This meeting is cancelled." As he pulled his phone out, James stood up. "Sit down," Phil said, a little more sharply than he had meant to. At least he saw a little rebellion in James, which relieved him more than anything else. "Sit," he insisted, nevertheless. Looking mutinous, James did as he was told. It didn't take him long to reach Ken and Malcolm, and he put them off with a simple excuse before turning back to James. The empty expression on James's face almost had Phil calling for help of the medical kind. He had never seen James so lifeless. Usually their lead singer was the hyperactive centre of the band. "James," he said in a much gentler tone, sitting down opposite his friend. "Please talk to me. This has nothing to do with the band. Right now I'm just your friend. Is there something going on you haven't told us?" James finally looked at him and frowned, before looking away again. "I think I'm going mad," were the quiet words that eventually fell reluctantly from James's lips. Even though what James said was worrying in itself, Phil could not help being relieved that James had actually spoken to him. "Why?" he asked, totally out of his depth, but knowing he needed to help his friend somehow. James began twisting his fingers together as Phil watched him. Phil could clearly see that his friend was on the verge of falling apart. I hear voices, James said in little more than a whisper. Phil went cold. This was worse than he had thought. And what do they say? He asked carefully, knowing that he was on very dangerous ground. James looked up at that, for a few moments at least. They don't tell me to go out and kill people if that's what you're worried about, was the surprisingly sarcastic reply, which was a nice change given James's state. But it didn't last. It's random things, James eventually admitted, much more quietly. Like people around me say things, only I know they haven't spoken aloud. It's like I'm making up conversations in my head. I thought I was just imagining stuff, but it keeps getting worse. For a while, Phil really didn't know what to say. He'd never heard of anything like this before. It didn't sound good at all. When did it start? Phil asked, and James looked up at him as if it had never occurred to the vocalist to think of that. Was it after you fell? James thought about that for a few moments before nodding his head. James, you've been having what are probably auditory and visual hallucinations since you hit your head and you haven't told anyone? Phil really couldn't believe it. James looked sort of lost. Come on, Phil said, taking charge since James seemed incapable of it. Where are we going? James asked, following without protesting. To see a specialist, Phil said in a tone that begged no argument. You could have pressure on the brain or something. James appeared to be about to object, but then his friend looked at him, grimaced and just nodded. James was terrified. So terrified he was almost at the point where he didn't care who knew. If Phil hadn't dragged him to the hospital, he wasn't sure what he would have done. But as it was, he found himself sitting in a consultant's office with Phil on one side and the consultant, Dr. Bolton, across the desk. How Phil had got him the appointment he didn't know, but he was half glad and half annoyed that his friend had managed it. Mr. Pritchard, the consultant said, and he dared a look up to let the woman know he was listening. Can you tell me what's happening to you? James sat there for a while, eyes skipping from one thing on the desk to another, before he could will up the courage to tell the truth. I hear voices, he said, and glanced up very quickly to gauge her reaction. All the time? Dr. Bolton asked, managing to sound as if she wasn't about to commit him. James shook his head. Only sometimes, he admitted, more when I look at people or touch people. And when you look at or touch people, you hear their voices? She asked in a calm, professional tone. James nodded this time. That was exactly it. This only started after a head injury, is that correct? Dr. Bolton inquired carefully. He nodded again. Then it is most likely that the cause is physiological, she said in a reassuring manner. It is quite possible that you have a residual clot causing pressure on your brain, which is generating confusion between your optical and auditory neural functions. Considering that it seems to have been getting worse, I'm going to schedule you for tests today. Once we know what is going on inside your head, we should be able to fix it. If you have any appointments for today, Mr. Pritchard, I suggest you cancel them. James had expected to be told he was going insane. That there was possibly a simple explanation was the best news he'd had all week. He looked at Phil, who gave him a supportive smile and nodded his consent. He'd been prodded, he'd been poked, he'd had people looking into his eyes, his ears, and even his nose. He'd been x-rayed, and he'd even been CAT-scanned. So far, he had no idea if the host of people trying to solve his case were any closer or not. Phil had been there the whole time, for which he was inordinately grateful, but he was sure his friend had to be completely bored. It was 4 hours after he had first left that he found himself back in Dr. Bolton's office. "There's no clot," were the words James had been dreading. "There is some indication of bruising, but it appears to have almost completely healed." He was going insane after all. That was going to make for a great press release. "So it's psychological?" he asked, not wanting to hear any long, drawn-out description of the fact that he was mentally ill. "I don't think so," was the unexpected reply, and he glanced up for a second to see if the woman was hedging. "I don't understand," he admitted, as his eyes flicked back to the desk before his problem could rear its ugly head. There was a pause, but James did not look up to see why. He was too busy trying to work out what could possibly be going on. "I took the liberty of observing all your tests," Dr. Bolton said eventually, "and I believe your situation may be very rare. When you hit your head, there seems to have been considerable bruising, and I believe this caused your brain to attempt to rewire around the injury until it healed. This is quite normal, but I believe your brain may have made connections to neural centers that do not often occur. If you would not mind, I would like to try something to see if I can confirm my diagnosis." "What?" James asked, very uncomfortable with the whole conversation. "I would like you to look at me and then tell me what you hear." It sounded like a waste of time to James, but who was he to argue with a specialist? Reluctantly, he took his eyes off the desk and slowly raised them until he was looking Dr. Bolton directly in the eyes. It didn't happen straight away, but very shortly after he met her gaze, words drifted into his head. "Team Rocket blasts off at the speed of light," he said, feeling utterly ridiculous. Surprisingly, this earned him a smile. "My son's current obsession," Dr. Bolton said with a small shrug. "We are subjected to the reruns daily at home." James had no idea what was going on. "You're not hearing imaginary voices, Mr. Pritchard," the doctor told him. "You're hearing what people are thinking." For a few moments, James just sat there and wondered if he was hallucinating again. "Did you just say," he began to ask. "That you are telepathic? Yes," Dr. Bolton said before he could finish the question. "But that's impossible," James said, and seriously considered that he had totally lost it, and the whole day might have been one long delusion. "Rare, ignored by most modern science, and generally disbelieved by society," Dr. Bolton replied with a supportive smile. "But not impossible. I'm afraid I cannot help you in this area. But here is the card of a professor at King's College. I've assisted her with some of her research in the past, and I believe she may be able to give you some guidance." James took the card in numb fingers. He couldn't really believe that a professional physician had just told him that he was something out of a comic book. He found himself staring at her in shock. "This is real," filtered into his mind. "I urge you to talk to Professor Dimmond. She can help you." This was just completely mad. James considered checking himself into an institution just to get away from it. "James," it was Phil's voice that eventually brought him back to reality as his mind tried to grasp what he was being told. "Are you all right?" For the first time in a while, he looked his friend directly in the face, just to find out what would happen. He couldn't believe anything that was going on, not really. This had to be a cosmic joke. "We'll find someone else to help, don't worry, James." He almost laughed when he heard Phil's voice. "You just thought about finding another specialist," he said, needing to know if he really was losing his mind. Phil looked startled. He guessed. "I did not guess," James responded, as if they were having a conversation. "Fuck. Exactly how I feel," he said, and looked away. Either the whole world was crazy, or Dr. Bolton was not a sandwich short of a picnic. In that moment he really did not know what to do, and he clutched the card in his hand like a lifeline. It had taken a while and a few direct demonstrations to convince Phil that what Dr. Bolton had said was true. After that, going to see Professor Dimmond seemed like the only sensible course of action. James had picked out his most nondescript clothes, pushed his rather eye-catching hair under a beanie so it looked nothing like most of the publicity shots, found his never been in a photo shoot and never will be sunglasses that were reserved purely for disguise, and taken a taxi to the university. He had called ahead the previous day to ask when the professor could see him, but he had not given much of an explanation, using a fake name to book the appointment. He really did not want this in the press because his life wouldn't be worth living if it got out. Half the world would think he'd lost the plot, and the rest would be trying to get into his brain. Keeping his head down and his eyes very firmly on the directions he had been given over the phone, he walked through the university. He went to the professor's office and was met by one of the professor's grad students, a chatty young woman called Sam. "I'm sorry, Professor," he heard as he was led into a large room that had walls painted totally white, "but I can't get anything today." The voice was coming from a speaker on the outside of a booth within which a blonde young man was sitting wearing a blindfold and headphones. The only other person in the room was a middle-aged woman of medium height who seemed to be wearing a cardigan that had seen better days. James had to assume this was Professor Dimmond. "Thank you, Brad," the professor said as she pushed a button on the panel in front of her. "You can come out now. We'll try again tomorrow." "Professor Dimmond," Sam said as the woman went to write something down, "I've brought Mr. Jones." Professor Dimmond turned around so quickly that James did not have time to look away. He found himself on the end of a firm stare. What surprised him as he looked into the woman's face was that, even as he braced himself against finding out exactly what Professor Dimmond was thinking, nothing came. He was pretty sure he stood there with his mouth open like an idiot. "Mr. Jones," Dimmond greeted with a smile and began to walk over. "So sorry I couldn't meet you, but we were in the middle of an experiment. How may I help you?" James looked at Sam and then at the aforementioned Brad, who was disconnecting himself from something involving the booth. He wasn't sure what to say. "Anything you say here will be completely confidential," Professor Dimmond said, as if she was the one reading minds. "And Sam and Brad are involved in all of my projects." "Dr. Bolton gave me your card," was where he decided to start. "A couple of weeks ago I hit my head and now, well, he felt like a bit of an idiot. I hear what people are thinking." Professor Dimmond looked surprised and then thoughtful. "A very interesting predicament," was the woman's conclusion. "And how often does this happen?" "Whenever I look at people or touch them," James said. "Except you," he added, since he figured it could be important. "How about now?" James almost stepped back. He did start, since he'd never felt anything quite like it. It wasn't as if the words drifted into his mind. It was like they were put there quite deliberately. "Yes," he said with a nod, "I heard that." "Remarkable," Professor Dimmond said with a smile. "I imagine it must be a bit of a shock to be thrown into this so suddenly." "That's one way of putting it," James replied. "A shock was understating it a bit. I thought I was going insane for a while." "And you wouldn't be the first telepath to have been diagnosed as schizophrenic," Professor Dimmond said with a sad smile. "Unfortunately, very few accept the existence of the phenomenon. With my work, I hope to prove that all human beings are slightly psychic and bring the field into the mainstream." James really didn't care what the professor was up to, but he tried to look interested, since he was hoping the woman would have some way of fixing him. Do you think you can help me? He asked, needing to know if he was on a wild goose chase or not. Well, I can certainly put you in contact with someone in the same situation as yourself, the professor said with a smile, and I suspect it would help you to be able to test your abilities in a safe environment. So I would say yes. What James really wanted was to get rid of whatever these abilities were and go back to what he had been, but he was beginning to realize that was highly unlikely to happen. When can we start? He asked, trying not to sound as depressed as he felt. I have a couple of hours free now, Dimon said kindly, as if she had some notion of what James was feeling. So we could run some tests and see how extensive your abilities are. James nodded. Thank you, he said, and he meant it. After all, this woman didn't know him from Adam. Sam, the professor said, let's set up the card area. Sam smiled and bounced off to another part of the room. James followed when the professor indicated the way. If you'd like to sit on that side, Dimon invited as Sam moved around the table area, putting things on the side the professor had not indicated. And put on the headphones. They produce white noise and eliminate other distractions. It would probably be a good idea to take your glasses and hat off as well. James wasn't sure about that, but he did as he was asked. Sitting down, he took off his dark glasses and beanie before pulling on the headphones and allowing the world to fade to nothing in his ears. This made what he saw next quite funny, since there was no sound. Sam stood up from where she was pulling something from a shelf, took one look at him, and screamed before seemingly falling over her own feet. James snatched off the headphones and stood up again so that he could see over the desk to where Sam was sitting on the floor. The girl looked utterly stunned and appeared to be mouthing his name silently over and over again. His real name, that was. Sam, are you all right? The professor asked, clearly clueless as to her grad student's behaviour. It was then that Brad wandered over, having finished whatever he had been doing at the booth, and stopped dead. James Pritchard, the young man said without the slightest trace of doubt in his voice. The professor looked at him now. I believe I may be missing something, was Dimon's conclusion. I'm a musician, James said, hoping to get away with playing it down. Sorry I used a false name. Who happens to be in the band with the current #1 album, Brad filled in, and the professor seemed to suddenly understand. Ah, Dimon said with a smile, and offered her hand to help Sam up while she continued to look at James. Now I believe I understand your reticence. Don't worry, no one will hear that you are here from us. James smiled his thanks as a rather embarrassed Sam climbed to her feet. He sat back down and pulled on the headphones again. In the first test, the professor held up cards with the front side facing away from James and asked him what was on them. He got 100%. After that, the testing went on most of the afternoon, following which, the professor taught James a few mental techniques for keeping the voices at bay. By the time James made it home, he had just enough wherewithal to text Phil and tell him what had been going on before he fell into bed and slept soundly for the first time in weeks. James was back at the university the next day as instructed. Only he wasn't in a great mood. He'd been practicing the blocking techniques that Dimond had given him, but they made his head ache, and he had a migraine from hell. What was frustrating was the exercises themselves seemed to work, but it was as if his brain fundamentally objected to him trying to shut out the voices. If he was ever going back on stage, he had to get this under control. He only hoped it would become less painful with practice. It gets easier. The words were placed in his mind very deliberately, and a hand appeared in front of him holding a glass of water and 2 pills. Migraine painkillers, the unfamiliar voice spoke aloud this time, the only thing that'll touch a block headache. James took the pills and the water and knocked them back without even considering not doing it. It was only after he'd done it that he realized the pills could have been anything, but that he had completely trusted the person he hadn't even looked at yet. He turned to look at the young man standing next to him. "Hello," his companion greeted silently with a smile. "I'm Tim." "Hi, I'm James," he responded in kind, as if it was the most natural thing in the world. It was the same as the pills. Only after he had done it did it occur to him that it felt as natural as breathing, even though it was weird. "It is natural," Tim said, aloud this time, "at least for us. It's difficult at the beginning, but everything will become easier with practice. You're doing much better than I did when my gift first awoke. I hid in my room until my mother dragged me to the doctor. They wanted to commit me, but Mum brought me to the professor instead." "I wanted to commit myself," James admitted, and could not help wondering why it was so easy to talk to a man he had literally only just met. Tim laughed at that. "That would have been sad," Tim said, still smiling. "I'm looking forward to your next single." Well, that answered that question. Tim knew who he was. "I'm sure I'd have managed to find an asylum with a recording studio," he joked back. "Enough of us are certifiable." He was quite amazed that his headache was disappearing already. There was no way the drugs could have hit his system that fast. "Is talking to you helping with the migraine?" he asked, wanting to try out the other form of communication again. "Probably," Tim replied, beckoning him and setting off to where Sam was fiddling with something in the corner. "It's the way your brain is wired now. Blocking is unnatural, so it takes work, and until you're used to it, it hurts." That made a weird kind of sense. "Of course, letting too much in will hurt as well, like having to listen to people shout at you," Tim continued. "But you'll find the balance. Before you know it, you won't know what you did without the voices." "Really?" he asked, not quite sure he could believe that. Tim nodded with a smile. "The human brain is an amazing thing," Tim told him. "You'll adapt remarkably quickly. If you were going to crumple under the pressure, you'd be catatonic by now." That was news to him, and he couldn't help wondering how close he had come to just shutting down. "I see you two have met," the professor's voice broke into his contemplations, and he looked up to find that they had been intercepted. "Tim saved me from a headache the size of London," James replied silently, and then realized what he had done when Dimon's eyes opened in shock. "Sorry," he apologized immediately. How did I do that?" It finally occurred to him that he hadn't known that was possible, considering that the professor was not telepathic. "Looks like you have good instincts," Tim said, seemingly amused. "I just wouldn't try it on anyone else without having Valium on hand. The professor is used to us, but it's best to break it to other people gently." James didn't doubt it. His future was looking more and more bizarre, but was slowly becoming less terrifying. Now all he had to do was figure out how to make sure Tim didn't realize he'd just checked out the other telepath's backside in very nicely fitting jeans, and he might get through the day without dying of embarrassment. Did you enjoy James's journey? I very much hope you did. Thank you very much for joining me for the story. Please let me know what you thought in the comments. Thank you. If you did enjoy this week's tale, please give it a like using the thumbs up button. And I would love it if you would subscribe so you never miss a vid. It also really helps me and boosts the channel. And it's totally free apart from the odd ad. Thank you so much. There is an ebook version of the story on Amazon and all the other major retailers if you would like a copy to keep. And this week, it has extra scenes. The original version was too long for the episode, so there's fun extra content in the book. The micro stories from this week are also in it. There is a link in the description, or scan the QR code on screen now. See you next week. As always, we'll have 4 YouTube shorts on Monday to Thursday and another longer video on Friday. And now I have a restful, adorable kitty for you. Ruby was sleeping so sweetly this morning, I had to film her. Just look at those toe beans. Thank you for watching.